Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to be focusing on chapter 13, which is interviewing young clients. So, by the time we're done this chapter, we're going to be able to focus on a couple of things, but understand that when we're interacting with children and teens, it's much different than interacting with adults. The younger the person is, the more different it is going to be. Think about it from this perspective. When we are working with younger people, they are not going to have the same skills. They're not going to have the same language set. They're not going to have the same cognitive ability or resources available to them that an adult does. So, when working with children and adolescents and teens, remember that it is not going to be the same as working with an adult. We will ask similar questions, we will gather similar pieces of information, but we certainly have to use different skills in order to do so. So this chapter is going to include different recommendations for interviewing and initiating therapy with someone who is not an adult. So by the time we're done, we're going to be able to list some major developmental and countertransference considerations when working with a child or someone who's younger than us. We're going to describe the preparation, planning, and first contact issues during the introduction stage. We're also going to describe issues associated with the opening stage, as well as the body stage and closing and termination stages. And finally, we're going to look at 6 different research and common sense principles when working with younger clients who are culturally diverse, especially if they come from a different culture than us. So, the first thing to consider when working with younger people is the opportunity that countertransference may actually arise. When we think about countertransference, as we've talked about in previous chapters, this is the emotional reaction that we as the therapists have to our clients. And it's easy for us to be able to over identify with children because we may have experienced similar situations as them, or something about their story resonates with us. On the other side, we may find that we withdraw from children because we can't identify with their struggles. We don't understand where they're coming from, or we have ourselves worked on avoiding or blocking the experiences that may be brought up to by the child that you're working with, and it becomes so similar that we now don't know how to react because we ourselves, as part of our coping mechanisms, haven't addressed it because we've avoided it or we've blocked it out. So as these things are arising, we may find that we distance ourselves physically and cognitively and within the session from the child. We have to also keep in mind that children aren't just like us. So it requires us to understand the cultural divide. We are going to be older than the children that we work with. We have different life experiences. We come from different generations. We have a much different socio-cultural atmosphere today than we may have experienced. Some of those things may include the fact that we may never have had to prepare for a school shooter. We may not have had access to as many electronic devices. So you may find that more kids today, not only do they have some type of addiction to an electronic device like a cell phone or an iPad, but they also may lack social skills because they lack that one-on-one interaction versus us, where we had a lot of interpersonal interactions. They may be watching video games a lot or violent movies and TV shows. So they may be desensitized to violence, whereas we were not. So we have to remember that children aren't just like us, and that we have to work on understanding their perspectives. We have to work on finding out where it is that they came from, how they got to the place that they were, and that may take research. That may take us submersing ourselves into aspects of their culture and looking at things like some of the more popular TV shows and movies and video games, familiarizing ourselves with different cell phone apps and social media websites in order for us to put ourselves into their position to understand where some of the differences may lie. When it comes to kids, it is often their stories, depending on how much is detailed, depending on how much trauma they may have been through, depending on what their story is like and how it resonates with you. If you start experiencing countertransference, always remember to process that as soon as possible with your supervisor. If you think that you may be experiencing countertransference, seek support with that right away. Something that may come up that may lead us to want to engage in countertransference even more, or if we are noticing that countertransference is arising, it often will be seen in us wanting to be able to rescue those children. We want to look at them and help them and possibly give them tools and resources that we didn't have, opportunities that we may not have had, or help them in the way that we would, and essentially become like a second parent or an alternative parent to the child. If you find that those types of thoughts and feelings are arising in you, first of all, notice them. Second of all, don't become panicked. It's okay to experience these things. It is not okay to act on these things. It can actually get you in trouble. So the first thing we need to do is notice when we are starting to have these thoughts or these feelings arise where we want to engage in rescuing these children. Process what that means for you, and then seek supervision as soon as possible from your supervisor. Explain to them that you're working with this child and that you have this desire to want to help them, and that you're trying to process through it and you're struggling with it, or that in starting to process through it, these are the reasons that make you want to rescue that child, and that you recognize that this is in fact countertransference. And then what can you do to work through that, not only in the session, but you may have to do work on yourself outside of the session. Let's talk about the introduction. When we are preparing and planning for a child to come in, most younger people are not willingly seeking therapy. They are externally focused. A parent or the court system is forcing them to come see somebody. So when you are arranging an initial interview, you're not working with the child. Your communication will not be with the child. It will be with the caregiver. It'll be with their parent. It'll be with whoever is going to be bringing them in. If the courts are involved, you may have to coordinate it with the courts, or you might have to coordinate it with the person who is bringing the child and then follow up with the court system. So arranging that initial interview may present challenges. Often they're scheduling challenges. In addition, part of that scheduling may mean that they might not be able to come during the day. So hopefully you can arrange something after school hours if necessary. You have to decide consciously whether you want to meet with the parents and the caretakers or not. There's pros and cons in meeting with them. You can do it in one of several ways, which we're going to be talking about more in this video. The first way is just meeting the child independently during that initial session, and then meeting with, or just meeting with the child for the initial session. You then, during the second session, can either meet with the parent or caretaker individually or with the child. You may decide that part of your initial session is going to be where this initial interview rather is going to be that you want to meet with the parent and the child together. And then the second session, you'll meet with the child independently. And then the third session, you'll meet with the parent or caregiver individually. Whatever you decide to do, however your agency decides to do it, I would definitely find what's going to work best for you. Some agencies may require that you meet with both of them for the initial session. Some agencies may require that you only meet with the child with parental consent for that initial session. There are pros and cons with both. If you meet with the child and the caretaker in the first session, it may make therapeutic rapport a little bit more difficult, because often what happens is that parents and caregivers tend to overspeak. They tend to engage more in that conversation than the child does, which leads the child to not be able to participate as much. They may then feel as if you are not going to give them an opportunity to speak because the parent and caretaker are speaking for them or on their behalf. It may be hard to control the session with that. But a pro to that could be that having the parent or the caretaker there may give you a glimpse, depending on how their interaction is between the child and the parent caregiver. You may be able to get a glimpse into some of the behavioral aspects that happen outside of the session. It may give you a glimpse into how the child is either hyperactive, overactive, not active enough, isolating or withdrawing, um, whether they are, what their body language is when their parent or caretaker is around. Does the parent or caretaker speak a lot for the child? So the child doesn't have a developed voice. Those can give you little insights into some of the concerns of the child. Now, on the flip side, if you meet with the child first and then meet with the caretaker or parent later, or at the second session, it gives you an opportunity as a pro to build a therapeutic rapport. It also allows the child the ability to be able to speak freely or as freely as they choose with you. Some children may be more open than others. It just depends on the child. It depends on you. It depends on the connection that you're able to make. When we are thinking about using meeting with the child rather in that initial session by themselves, you may be able to get a little bit more information. And then in the second session, by just meeting with the parent or the caregiver alone, it can give you a different perspective. In addition, by meeting with the child during the first session, you can essentially get buy-in for them to then meet with the parent or the caregiver, which gives them a sense of power. And it also gives them a sense of that this treatment is part of a process, but that they are a voice in this process. Some cons, though, are that if the child isn't willing to speak during that session, it may be difficult to really gather information. It'll give you some insight as to where the child is functioning at, but if you can't get any information, it might be a little bit challenging. Another con would be that if the child says that they don't want you to speak to the parent or the caregiver, then you may have to essentially start bargaining or negotiating with the child to, help them to see that you're not going to be sharing a lot of information with the parent, you're just gathering information. So you might spend more of the session in getting this buy-in than actually finding out what's going on for the child. So again, when it comes to this, your agency and your supervisor will be able to direct you as to whether you will meet with the child by themselves first, and then you meet with the parent by themselves, and then, talk about bringing them together at some point. Whether two, you meet with them together, and then you meet with the child independently, and then the parent independently, and then move on from there. Or third, if you meet with the parent first and then you meet with the child and then decide at what point do you bring everybody in together. Again, your supervisor or your agency will be able to direct you as to what works best. In my experience, what I have done, not only in private practice, but in some of the agencies that I've worked at, is that I would meet with the parent first. Before bringing the child in, I would gather the information from the parent. I would meet with the parent or the caregivers independently first to find out why the child was being brought in to see me for support, what is happening, or what are they reporting to me that is happening. And then I lay out the process for them to let them know that I will be meeting with the child independently. And then the child and I will decide as a team if and when we want to bring the parent structure in. That is what has worked best for me. But again, it depends on your supervisor and your agency. When we're thinking about the introduction or the continued introduction, when it comes to the first contact, that may be extremely overwhelming. Children, again, they may not understand the process depending on the age that they're at. You are a stranger. They don't know if they can trust you. They don't know what is going on. And if you're meeting with the parents and the caretaker in the session, they may become overwhelmed. They may feel attacked. They may feel like they don't have a voice, especially as I had said earlier, if the parent caregiver is talking over the child or speaking for the child. So there may be some management issues within the session. It's really important that written informed consent should be followed up by a talk about confidentiality. You may have to paraphrase this for the child as well as the parent caregiver, depending on who they are, but the parent is going to be the one signing the majority of the documentation. The child will be signing it, but might not understand what they're signing. So it's important that you talk about, that anything that happens within these four walls, stay within these four walls, unless they report that they want to hurt themselves or someone else, or if they report that there is some type of child abuse for people under the age of 13, or elder abuse of people who are 65 years of age and older. Otherwise, whatever's said in these four walls stays in these four walls. If you really hit home on that, that may allow them to open up. If you don't have this clear upfront plan on how you're going to manage the sessions, how you're going to manage the different things within a session, how you're going to work on redirecting people, whether it's the parent, caregiver, or the child, you might lose control of the session. And losing control of the session in that kind of chaos may further blemish the therapeutic rapport, because this might be a similar situation that the child is used to. And if they're seeing this being modeled for them within the session, they might not feel like they can trust you, or they might look at you and be like, well, why should I talk to you if I'm coming here to get help and you're just creating a similar situation that I'm experiencing at home or at school or both? So make sure you have a plan in place. That is something that you can work on with your supervisor. So let's talk about the opening. First impressions are huge, because it can be hard sometimes for us, if we're so used to interacting with adults, to be able to connect with young people. We, again, come from different generations. We might be significantly older than the child. We may look like we're closer to the child's age, but guess what? What they've experienced and what we've experienced are two different things. Just even if it's just a few years apart, we still have different lived experiences than children do. So when we are thinking about trying to connect with them, typically with adults, we might ask them, so how was it getting in here today? Oh, the weather's so nice. Oh my gosh, that traffic is such a pain in the neck. You can't do that with clients who are younger. So it's important to come up with, depending on their age, what might be, pretty appropriate for them. Like, how was school? I'm really excited to get to know you better. I heard that you like cheerleading, or I heard that you like soccer. I like that too. I'd love to hear more about, what you play or what you do. We have to make sure that we try not to parentify them or adultify them. So when we are engaging in this conversation, especially if you have both people in session with you, you can have some adult conversation, but always try to direct it back to the child, because the reason that all of you are in this room is because of the child. Another great way for kids to connect with them is to offer them like a small snack or a drink. I know in the past, when I've had private clients, I would have the little small pods of water that are about 4 to 6 ounces. And I'd always have little bags of either goldfish or fruit snacks. And I would offer a snack to the kid, especially if they were coming after school. They might be hungry. The parents might have been running late. So I would, bring out my basket and offer them the drink and snacks, for them to be able to, eat if they so choose. When we are looking at our office space and we're trying to manage our office, we need to try to make our office look younger. That doesn't mean that we're going to have posters of, 30 seconds to, Mars on our walls, or Hannah Montana on our walls, or even Barney posters. But we might have a bookshelf, a small bookshelf that's dedicated to children's books that they might identify with. We might have some pretty useful pieces of art that are on this bookshelf or in different places in our office. If we can remain pretty neutral in our office and include things like more vibrant colors in certain aspects, that's a way for us to be able to attract a younger audience. We have to let the clients notice particular items on their own, which is part of their exploratory behavior. As younger people, they're going to be looking a lot more at some pretty defined objects. So if they see a stuffed animal, if they see a tray table that has sand in it, if they notice really vibrant artwork, if they notice books of different ages, then they might be able to kind of see that and gravitate towards it, and they might bring it up to you or say something to you about it. What I've done in the past is I've had a, IKEA bookshelf, and I would have, starting at the bottom, I would have some baskets that were clear with toys in them. I'd also have baskets with coloring books and crayons and markers. And then on the next shelf, I would have younger books, books that you would use for anywhere from ages 2 to like 5. The next shelf was 5 to around age 8. The shelf up above that was like ages 9 through, the end of middle school. And then the shelf above that was high school types of books, like fiction, nonfiction types of books. And then on the top of the shelf, I would have, some stuffed animals. I would have some really cool pieces of artwork. People who have drawn stuff for me in the past, I put that up there as well. Next to it, I would have 2 baskets. One was full of different types of dolls, and the next basket was full of different stuffed animals, and also a small blanket. That way, they'd be able to see. For a younger person, they're typically shorter, so I'd leave the younger stuff closer to the ground, and then as they got older in age, it went up on the bookshelf. It was a way for my clients to be able to see that I kind of understand where they potentially are, because I don't know their journeys, I don't know their stories, but it also allowed them to know that I had a section that was designated just for them. And it typically was right in the peripheral. As soon as you walk in the door, you saw this bookshelf. For many of my, also my offices, I should note that I had my desk and my chairs, but I also had on one side of my room, I had a smaller table and chairs, 4 chairs around it, and I always had crayons and coloring books on top of it. So that way, for some of my clients, if they really struggled in communicating, I had regular coloring books and also emotion word coloring books that we could use together, and we would color while we had our sessions. We also want to think about how we dress. We don't want to be too formal, so wearing a suit to work might be a turnoff for our younger clients, but we don't want to be too casual, so coming in our pajamas is not going to work. So it might be a mixture of both. Depending on your agency rules and settings, that can look different for different things. That might mean business casual, and maybe if you're a gentleman, you unbutton the first couple of buttons of your shirt and you roll up your sleeves. If you're a woman, maybe you can wear things like jeggings, where they're jean leggings, to work. In my experience, when I had my younger clients, they were typically in the afternoons and on the weekends. So on Saturdays primarily. So in the settings on Saturdays, I wore jeans or jeggings. In the evenings, I would change my pants. Like, I'd keep a nice shirt on and a sweater, but I would typically change my pants for more formal dress pants for the adult clients I would see during the day to jeans or jeggings in the evening, because that's when I was seeing my younger clients, and I found that the way that I dressed really made an impact. If I was more casual in my experience, in my appearance rather, that made the experience more casual. When I would dress up, like I would wearing business attire, then they would often be more closed off. So again, you're going to default to your agency and you're going to default to your supervisor about this guidance. Again, discussing confidentiality with our clients is going to be imperative. Again, you are going to have your clients, they are going to be signing, the parents are going to be signing a lot of the forms on behalf of the client, but there are a couple forms that your agency may have the younger client themselves sign. So you definitely want to talk to them, again, about the limits of confidentiality, how parents can hold the right to their teens' records, how you would hope the parents would allow their teen to talk openly and not use that process to access their notes in a negative way or take advantage of that. And also discussing with both the child and the parent how much you guys are actually going to be willing to communicate and disclose to each other. In some situations, you may find that leaving it at a behavioral level is what's going to be most appropriate. So for example, if the teen is working on, or the child is working on issues related to explosive outbursts, that you may have a conversation with the parent, either before the session in person or via email sent before the session, where the parent talks about how many times in the previous week or since you had last seen them that there were explosive outbursts, and find out what led to the outburst. Then when the child comes in and you talk to the child, you can say, so how was this week with, flipping out, flying off the handle, whatever terms they use. And then find out, is that accurate? Like, oh, are you sure you only got mad 3 times? Because, you know, sometimes we tend to flip out a little more, or even say, your mom or your caregiver or your dad said that you might have gotten angry a little bit more, and that's okay. So if it happened more than 3 times, let's talk about that, because getting angry really stinks. It can make us feel tired. It can make us feel sick. It's not really a fun experience. So let's try to find ways that we can reduce this so that you can feel better. So you definitely want to address with both the parent and the child together what are going to be the limitations. That way you can still keep the therapeutic rapport with the child, still keep the therapeutic rapport with the parent, and everyone can come to a consensus. When you're looking at a referral and background information, it's important to tell the younger person, if they don't know why they came here, you need to be honest with them and transparent and let them know why they were sent there. It's important for them to know this, but before you even go there, you've got to get the client's perspective. If they don't know why they're there, then you can provide that education to them. If they know that they were sent because they had some behavioral issues, then you can talk about, okay, so what do you know about behavioral issues? What issues are you experiencing? And then you can start trying to pinpoint some of the triggers that are associated with it. Be ready and be available for a number of different responses. The responses that a child may give you versus why they were referred could be similar, or it could be vastly different. Again, the child's perspective is going to be different based on their age and based on their understanding of what is happening in the world around them. So you may get a very different experience, and that's okay. Also, too, we need to talk about wishes and goals. So we need to introduce wishes in 3 parts. One is going to be how they want to change. The second is going to be how they want their family to change. And third is going to be how they want school to change. Typically, because they're coming in and depending on their age, they're primarily going to be externally focused. It's probably going to be easier to focus on, okay, you might be having issues and concerns at home with your family. You might be having issues at school with your friends and peers and teachers. Those are the 2 most common stressors that kids typically have. What can we do to alleviate some of those things, or to work on some of those things? And then by proxy, it'll help with them. So we need to kind of relate it to those situations, but then bring it back on them. Okay, so what I'm hearing you say is that you want to get along better with mom and dad. So you hope that mom and dad can do this, maybe communicate with you differently, or be clear in how they communicate. But what can you do as part of that as well? If they ask you to clean your room and you don't feel like it, how can we work on you communicating that to your parents, or telling or coming up with a time where it is known by both you and your caregivers and parents that you're going to clean your room, say Saturday mornings between 10 and 11 a.m. So you may have to externally focus it at first, but then always bring it back to them and include them as far as having that shared responsibility. It's also important to get the parent or the caretaker goals. I would not have them give you a full-blown list, because they might come up with 1,000 things. Ask them to pick the top 3 things that they would like to see change. Typically, they're going to be able to give it to you in larger chunks. So maybe they want them to communicate better. They want them to minimize negative behaviors, and they want to increase active participation at home and at school. Well, those are 3 really big goals. So you may be able to work with the parent and the child, get the information from the parent and work with the child, so they're able to look at a couple of different things from each of those goal areas. So, maybe it's not flipping out as much. Okay, if they don't want to flip out as much, that's part of the negative behavior. So everyone can be satisfied with, that as being a goal. If the parent wants them to be more involved in school, and the child says that they, want to make more friends, maybe we can find a way to bridge that. So you always want to take what the child wants and what the parents want and bridge, and sometimes even compromise on different goals. The last thing is going to be about managing tension, because again, the parent may have different expectations than the child, and they may have different goals than the child. But again, the child is the reason that they're coming in to see you. So everything needs to be focused around the child as much as possible, while taking the parent information as, different tidbits of information. They're looking at it from partly an objective experience, but partly a subjective experience, because the child's behaviors or lack thereof, or their issues or concerns, may be negatively impacting the parents. So their subjectivity is going to be vastly important in understanding, but can't be the deciding factor in coming up with treatment goals for the child. Like with any form of therapy, the collaboration between the client and the therapist in creating goals is what is going to be beneficial. You need to have the buy-in from the child in order to do that. You can get input from the parents or caretakers. You can help to come up with goals that can satiate both what the child wants and what the parent wants, but it can't be the parent's directive, because the parents aren't the ones in therapy. And if it becomes about a session about the parents, maybe it might be helpful to talk with your supervisor about when the child comes to see you for therapy. Perhaps the parent or caregiver can seek their own individual support with the therapist at the same time. We definitely want to observe the parents and caretakers, because again, many of them have problems of their own, and they may want to use this session as a way to help themselves more so than to help their child. Typically, they don't explicitly plan to do this, but it can in fact happen. So if that is happening, it's okay to give the parents constructive feedback. It's also okay to have a conversation with your supervisor about, hey, maybe they can have an individual session with another therapist while I'm meeting with the kids, and then bring that up to the parent. Hey, when you come to sessions, I know that you love to chat with me before the sessions. It seems like that you might have a lot on your plate. I know that this process is super overwhelming. I just want to let you know, in case you're interested, while I'm meeting with little Bobby or little Susie, we do have another therapist or other therapists who would love to get to know you. So maybe, you both can receive support at the same time. What do you think about that? And then get them to start thinking about how that could or could not be a possibility. If you are finding that there are concerns that are coming up, that the parent is truly taking over, that the parent is not allowing the child to talk, especially when you're starting to have conversations about, in areas about neglect or any kind of abuse, the parent refuses to let the child talk or explicitly says, you are not to answer that. You definitely want to get your supervisor involved, because you may have to contact Childline to report some type of potential child abuse. You cannot get in trouble for making a concerned report, but you can get in trouble for making a false report and for making or for not reporting when you should. When this happens, it's super important as soon as the session is over to make an appointment as soon as possible with your supervisor and tell them, hey, when I was talking about having their needs met, is there any kind of abuse at home? Do your parents leave you for long periods of time? When I would try to ask these questions, the parent would not allow the child to speak. What do I do with this information? And then let the supervisor dictate, okay, I am going to work with you to make a call to Childline, or I am going to have a conversation with the parent, and then during this next session, you're just going to meet with the child by themselves and see if you can get some of this information out. If the child does then report that this is happening, you then have to make a report, and your supervisor will guide you through that process. We also want to make sure that we discuss the assessment and therapy procedures with both the parent and the child. If they're in the room together or separate, you may have to do this in, you use either adult language with adults and child language with the child, or if they're both in the room, it's really important to be able to communicate it in a way that the child understands, and by the child understanding, the parent by proxy should also understand. You also want to be very clear. This is the expectation of me. This is the expectation of you as the caregiver. This is the expectation of you as the child client. Honesty, transparency, confidentiality, that these are the parameters, these are the boundaries that we're setting. So if you are unsure, which you will be unsure the first couple of times you do this, definitely want to speak with your supervisor about, okay, so, what does this process look like for the agency? Or how would you offer some insight on how I can communicate things like the informed consent and confidentiality, HIPAA laws, and privacy? What the expectation or the role of the client and therapist and parent would be. It's always great to get that information. I would encourage you to essentially, as you're communicating this, put it on the level that the child understands, because if the child understands, then the parent or caregiver will also understand. You don't want to be too pushy about it. You also don't want to be too arrogant about it. There's going to be a fine way in how we communicate this by tone and body language. But essentially, we want to make sure that they understand, okay, that if you have any questions or concerns, that our office is open during these times, but I have different hours. So if something happens outside of hours, this is who you can contact. Let the parent know that if the behaviors do get really out of control, based on what your supervisor tells you, this is what you should do. Possibly call 911. Utilize this service or this resource if they have an after hours phone, etc. In the body of the interview, you definitely want to meet separately with the parent or the caregiver. So that can look like the same session where you meet with the child for a little bit and then just with the parents for a little bit if there's someone else who can stay with the child outside of the session, which some agencies do. I've never done. I typically, again, I speak with the parent separately and then I meet with the child. Some people meet with the child separately and then meet with the parents and then bring everyone in together. I do parents, child, I bring everyone together and then the child independently. When we are meeting with doing separation with just the parents or their caretakers, you have to use radical acceptance. Or it's encouraged, I should say, to use radical acceptance. Radical acceptance is essentially where you are, it's a form of DBT, and it's where you completely and are totally accepting what you are getting from your client. Whether you believe it or not, that's a whole other story, but you want them to know that you accept what they're saying, that you hear what they're saying, that you are listening to their concerns and their frustrations, their sadness, their joys, that you hear these things. And that will allow them to be open and honest and even transparent with you because someone is finally hearing them. And for some parents, they just want someone to hear them. You also want to assess the family in and of itself. You want to watch for any kind of behavior that starts to regress, or any type of dysfunctional patterns where, they used to be open in the way that they talk and now they're not. There used to be more open communication, now there's lack of communication. Or you're only going to communicate about certain things. That's part of the dysfunction that might be happening in the household. You're seeing it in the child and you're starting to see it in the parent. Now we're seeing a pattern within the family. That may have to be addressed as a joint session. When we're thinking about assessments and information strategies, we want to kind of keep it basic. When it comes to children, they're going to put it in a language of, in some ways, all or nothing. So when we're first getting this information, we may have to put it in their language. So what do you understand? So tell me, why your parent or caregiver brought you here today. What do you understand from that? Okay. So what do you think is good about yourself? What do you think is bad about yourself? Because those are keywords that kids would use instead of strengths and barriers. They might not understand what that means yet. They may understand that as you go through the process, but when you're gathering information in this first session, they might not get it just yet. You may want to find out about how they understand who they are, how they perceive themselves, you know, and often again, this is externally focused. So how do others, if you were to ask your best friend, you know, what they like about you, what would they say? You know, think of like that person that you don't really get along with in school. If they had to say something about you, what would they say? And then, you know, how they would term those things or how they would be quick to answer or not answer, that speaks volumes about the child, it's themselves. If they're really having a hard time communicating, you can use different drawings. There's a number of different drawings that are available, like the draw a person or the kinetic family drawing or the house tree person. I will provide samples of those to you so that you can see what they're about, but that can help to generate some conversation. And you want to use them strictly for generating conversation. So you typically will talk in color or let the child color for a few minutes and then ask them about, you know, so what is it that you're drawing? And, oh, I really like that color blue. What made you choose that color blue or that color pink or purple or yellow or green? Don't interpret what they're doing. Let them tell you about this. Don't be subjective in that way, because your interpretation of that drawing may be vastly different than that of the child. If they draw something that is violent or that is depicting abuse, you definitely want to try to get clarification from the child about that. That may be a reason or a cause to contact your supervisor, get the supervisor involved, and then determine how you're going to proceed from there. That might be a conversation with the parent, that might be calling Childline, or a combination thereof. We want to have some general considerations within the interview. So limit the setting. It's often difficult, but you know, you might have to be a little bit more directive, like direct the child to sit, you know, hey, instead of saying sit anywhere you'd like, you might say, hey, would you like to sit here or here? If you know that you're working with a child, you know, you might bring out a couple of things and put it on your desk for them to be able to observe. You want to think about things that aren't going to take too long to clean up. So painting might not be the best idea, because if they spill the paint and it gets on the carpet or the table, that might now mean that you are going to have to clean up a lot. Therefore, it may back up your next session. And we talked about time boundaries. So it's super important that we try to do things that stay within time boundaries. So think ahead about, okay, what I'm bringing out is for the child or children. Is it enough for me to be able to do this and then to put it away rather quickly? That's why I used to put things in bins and containers, because it was easy to set out, let them choose what they want, and then I could put the bin at the end of the table and push everything in and put it back on the shelf. Easy cleanup. Arts and crafts, again, more or less formal. I would stay away from painting, and I would encourage more coloring or drawing if you're going to do something that is arts and crafts type of related. You also want to think about some non-directive, interactive, and directive play options. So when we think about non-directive, that is just letting them color on the page, or letting them, you know, share a story with you from a third person if they have the ability to do that. Some more interactive would be, you know, if you do like a hot potato game, like, okay, let's play hot potato. I'm going to ask you a question, and then you throw me the potato, and then you ask me a question, and then we go back and forth. So that would be a more interactive play. Something that is directive would be, okay, so I want you to draw me a house. And I want you to put in this house what your favorite room is and who your favorite person is and why. And then pick another part of that activity to build off of it. Maybe it's going to be, what's the scariest room for you in the house? And who's the scariest person in your house and why? And then you can have that conversation. If we're going to use fantasy, if we're going to use games, they have to have an intention behind it. It's not enough to say, oh, you know, I just want to kind of see what kind of stuff they can come up with. There has to be a reason for it. So if you're having them tell a story, if you're having them act, if you're having them play some type of game, like a card game or Uno or Old Maid, there has to be a reason behind it. Maybe it's to generate information. Using it as a therapeutic rapport method is not enough to justify doing that. So maybe it's, you know, we played a card game, and every time we brought up this number, we had a sheet that said this was the kind of question that you could ask and answer. And then, you would draw a card, and then you could ask the client that question, and then they could answer. When we're closing and terminating this session, we need to reassure that we're there to support our young clients, that we're there for them, that, we are looking forward to working with them, because a lot of younger people need support. They need to know that someone is going to be in their corner. They often don't have that or lack that in their life, which is one of the reasons they're coming to see you. You want to make sure that you validate and thank them for sharing their story with you throughout, and especially at the end, because for a lot of clients, they have what's called the recency effect. The recency effect essentially says that they'll remember the last parts of a session and the first parts of a session, in some other cases, but the recency effect itself says that they'll remember the last parts of the session more than anything else. So making an impact for the last parts of the session will encourage them to want to come back next time. You may want to summarize and what happened in the session. If you have any clarifying questions, you might want to ask them today, because if you ask them to clarify at the next session, they might forget, they might not remember what they said or what it meant. Also, get involvement from them. If you created an activity, let them help you clean up. If we need to straighten up a chair or put the chairs back, let them help you do that. Empower our younger clients. Encourage them to seek feedback, to seek questions that they may have from you. You already have a stance of power, being that you are the therapist and that they are the client. So they already look to you like you have this stance of power. They are looking up to you. So let them know, as part of this support and validation, that they can ask you, anything, and that you'll do your best to answer it. Don't tell them that you'll answer anything, because they might ask you some pretty personal questions that it's not appropriate for you to answer. But again, if they ask an appropriate questions, that gives you some insight as to what may be happening at home. There's a little seeds that you can now, put in the back of your mind to speak to your supervisor about. And if there's any loose ends in the session, you definitely want to tie them up before you end. So if you are giving them homework, make sure you give yourself enough time to review that homework as in depth as possible with the client. When we are summarizing and clarifying and engaging, again, doing the same things that we would do with adults, you're just going to be using child language. Ask them for any feedback. Ask them if they have any questions, and let them know it's okay to ask questions. By asking questions, we learn more, and that's important. When tying up loose ends, and getting ready to end, you want to not only reconnect them with their guardians or their parent, but also expect that there might be an increase in behavioral issues. If the parents are either directly or indirectly causing or contributing to behavioral concerns or negative thoughts, that might be something that you see at the end of the session, because that parent may have been removed during the session. So when they are joining them again, you may find that the child reverts back to that, which again gives you seeds of insight into what may be happening within the family. When we're looking at the culture in our younger clients, again, research and get information to guide you. It's not going to be the end all to be all, because you've got your clients who's a younger person who can educate you themselves. So be patient with your younger client. Be patient with yourself. If you don't understand something, ask your client to help explain it to you. That also in turn makes them feel good, because you're asking them a question and they can answer something that maybe they like. You want to have very, very clear expectations and set firm boundaries with our younger clients. Show and express an interest, even by asking them to clarify information. That's showing that you have an interest in something that they enjoy. And always be eager to learn more. Younger clients love when we are interacting with them and they want to know more about you, or they want to know more about what you like. So when you ask those you questions to our clients, it makes them feel really, really good. So as we wrap up this session, let's take into consideration that working with younger clients has similarities as to working with adults, but does have some differences. It's important to note that working with younger clients is going to be challenging. If this is a population that you want to work with, You will not be asking the same questions as you would an adult, but you can ask them similar types of questions. You may just be more directive and more creative in how you do it. And remember that what you're learning today is going to take time. That just because we had this session and this lesson doesn't mean that you're now an expert. In working with children, depending on the population that you're working with, you're going to have some kids that are super eager to participate and some kids that are not going to want to participate at all and are going to be very quiet. It's going to take time and practice to work with our younger populations. You are not a full expert on all things related to what 8-year-olds like. So get that insight from what an 8-year-old likes, because you might think 8-year-olds like Barbies, but really they like Hitachi moles. And you don't even know what a Hitachi mole is. I don't even know what really a Hitachi mole is. I just learned about it, honestly. So take these things into consideration. Understand that you are going to learn a lot from our clients based on their likes and based on their desires. Do your own research, because they have their own cell phones and they have access to resources online. They may be using social media that you'd never heard of that you should probably know a little bit about. They may be using apps that you had never heard before, but that by researching it, you find out that there's a high level of people who have predatory behavior that are on it. That can safeguard the child and inform the parents, like, hey, they talked about having this app on their phone. Let's not freak out over it, but let's kind of encourage, you being able to see more about what that's about, because if they're communicating with somebody, it may put them in danger. So again, it presents challenges. There's going to be a balance between working with the parents and caregivers and working with the child that you will develop over time, going to be specific to each family that comes in, and it's also going to be specific to your agency and your supervisor. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, as always, feel free to reach out to me and ask any questions. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Take care. Bye, y'all.